Hello, it's Bill here again, and you can see I've left it for a few days before I wanted to comment upon the chapter that we've been looking at this week, chapter 20, because it's very, very complex and takes me into areas where I have limited knowledge. And by that I mean the real function of what we're doing is to provide enough insights from the memorizations that we've done, the vocabulary that we've absorbed, so that we can get into actually translating the New Testament. And the question is, where do we go from here in the future? Well, if you follow it as I did another 2 years after I'd done all this, what you're doing now, which is the memorization and so on, over a year's period of 2 semesters, and then I started to translate the New Testament. And I began to work from there, and that solidified all the grammar. Now, having said that, there's different levels that you can go, because once you've done that, then you translate the New Testament, but you also then become interested in other things. In other words, the etymology, the development of a word, the historical origins of it, and you can pick it up in good grammars, Blass's grammar and so forth, and the one that I've mentioned, especially in your bibliography, by Wallace is very good in developing that, as well as many other grammatical elements. And the question is, how far do you want to go? Especially when you consider that probably at this level, if you can do sufficiently enough to start translating, and then later on you can use it in your sermons and classes where you can look up words and sentences, and with a lot of the Greek you'll be able to actually translate it there and use what you've got then in your sermons and classes, as opposed to actually developing a depth of sort of, like, if I can use a word like an iceberg. The iceberg is that we've got whatever it is at the moment, 2/10, say, that we're actually starting to know, and then maybe we go down to 3/10, and then the question is, do we want to go down to 7 or 8/10? Well, unless we're actually going to really study this in a way that causes us to go for 2 or 3 years, primarily studying Greek in detail in terms of looking at the origins, it's not necessary. And I feel that some of the material in chapter 20 that Mounce gives us is too much at this point, because it's very detailed, and it's very easy to lose the sight of the forest for the number of trees that we're looking at. So I just want to give you just a sort of simple way of actually negotiating this in element, and just say to you that as I mentioned last week, we're really dealing with the principal parts. And Mounce does say there's 2 ways of looking at this, and your teacher's going to give you one way, and I'm going to give you my way, simply because it's worked for me, and I think it's better, but at the same time I'm not going to dismiss the other way. My view of this, and what I'll do is I'll show you my book. This is a book by John Wenham called Elements of New Testament Greek, which I used in 1974-75. This is my original book, and I'm going to show you then that you've got the cover, and I'm going to show you the principal parts that I learned the verbal structures of each verb that's regular, so to speak, and then irregular verbs, and the number of times that they come in the New Testament, so that I'd learn the whole structure, the pattern of what to look for. Now, having said that, that's the way that I'm going to suggest to you that you do the same thing in respect to going to pages 370 to 383 in Mounce's book and doing the same thing, which is to take the principal parts of the verbs and write them out. And you do it, as I said when you first started this course, do it 3 times. Write them out and say them as you write them out, and then go over them and highlight them. That way, then, what you do is that you learn the structure of each of the tenses that we're talking about, and principal parts. Well, you know the present, and you know the future, and now you're learning, of course, that the present, well, before I mention that, let me just say this. You learn the present, you learn the future, you learn the aorist, active. These are all future too. Present, future, aorist, active. And then you learn the perfect active, and then the perfect passive, and then the aorist passive. Now, at the moment, you've only learned 2, but in the next couple of weeks, you're going to learn the rest of them. And then all the other tenses, middle and so forth, even pluperfect, will actually come from these tenses. In other words, they're the principal parts. Other structures can be made. For example, imperfect, that's not part of the principal parts, but frequently the imperfect is formed from the present. In other words, the stem. And one of the things that's fundamental from what you'll have picked up in this chapter is the difference between the root and the stem. All right? In other words, the stem of the present then is used frequently for the stem of the imperfect, and so on. But a big point that Mouse makes, which is really, really important, is that you look and see how these verbs are listed in lexicons in terms of the present frequently, but the present is a stem, it's not the root of the verb. And so therefore, what we have to know is the root of the verb frequently. Now, having said that, many of the stem and the root, so to speak, are very much the same. So from that standpoint, then it's not a problem. It's only a problem with what you might call irregular verbs, if I can use the word irregular in quotes there. And so the question then is, what do you learn? Well, in my view, instead of learning the complexity of how the verb has developed this particular origin, in some ways it's useful, but how far do you want to go? I'll explain that in a minute. It's better, I think, just to simply learn the the principal parts of the verbs. So that, let's take the paradigm, the basic one, luo. So present, luo. Future, we know adds a sigma, so it's luso. The endings of the present and the future active are exactly the same. And then when we get to the aorist, and you don't know this yet, but I'm just telling you, as I said last time, what you'll find is that the past tense has an augment. An augment means something is tacked on at the front. It's a prefix from that standpoint. And that's elusa. In other words, the sigma is still kept in there as it is in the future. And then in the perfect, the consonant at the beginning is replicated with the augment, so that then you have lelusa, leluka. And as I said last time, what you do is you recognize when you see that kappa in there toward the end of the verbal stem in the perfect, then you know that this is going to be perfect active from that standpoint. And then lelu mai is perfect passive, and eluthane is aorist passive. Again, you've got the old augment in there because it's aorist, and then the ending is going to have a theta in it, which will tell you that it's aorist passive. Now, don't worry about the four elements of those four tenses I've mentioned to you, because you're going to get that. The thing is, though, is I just want to give you a really big picture. The really big picture is that if you know the principal parts of X number of verbs, this is going to get you through it without actually knowing the detail. And I've put that on the screen so you can see what I'm talking about when I mention how the sigma, with is put in with the future. So in other words, with luo, it's not much of a difference because you've got the same endings. With the aorist, it's there, but you've got an augment, an epsilon at the beginning, but a different ending. We'll go do the endings and so forth in the near future. Likewise with the perfect, with the reduplication of the lambda for leluka, and then the kappa that will tell you that it's perfect active. And then in perfect passive, you've got the same thing with the augment and the replication of the consonant, the lambda. And then in the aorist passive, which has the augment, epsilon, and then it's got the theta in it. That tells me, as I said, when you're looking at these verbs, then that's going to tell me the tense. And I look for those. And let me just give you another one. I'll put this on too. This is from phileo, I love. Exactly the same thing, except, of course, is that you've got this verbal root that ends in an epsilon. So when I learned philo, I always learn it as phileo because I know then what the root is, what the stem is, and so on. So that in the future active, then the epsilon, as you know, lengthens to eta, and then there's a sigma in there. So it's fairly straightforward because what you're going to do is basically put whenever you come across the epsilon, you're going to thicken it, so to speak, and it's going to become an eta because it won't be able to stand next to the sigma and the consonant next to it. So philo or phileo, phileso, future, aorist active, philesa. I'm going to put up the luo table so you can see them next to each other, and then in respect to the perfect active, I'll explain this later, or actually Mouse will explain it later, that the psi there The duplication is back to the pi, which it originally was, so it's pephileima, pephileika in the perfect active, and then pephileimai in the perfect passive, and then in the aorist passive it's ephilethein. So you can see then, just generally speaking then, those are what I call regular, in the sense that they're not as difficult to learn off as the others. I think that's useful to say that as a template. I notice that Mounce puts the word regular in quotes sometimes, and I don't want to scare you on that. I'll give you one more, which will help maybe, which is airo, which means I lift up. I like that in terms of the cross being lifted up and so forth. So it's from that standpoint I've always remembered that verb. The present form, in other words, the present tense based from the root, but the stem of the present is ir, so it's iro. But the actual root of it is ar. In other words, the iota is not there. That's put there in the present. So the future is aro. And then in the aorist active, the alpha, just like the eta, is lengthened into just like the epsilon is lengthened to an eta, so it's era. And then erka in the perfect active, and you see you've got the kappa in there, and then ermai, which you'll actually work out from the endings of the perfect passive. And then finally erthane, which is again with the augment at the beginning, the alpha is extended to an eta, and the theta is in there that will tell you that it's going to be aorist passive. Now maybe that's too complex for you at the moment, but I'm just saying there are principal parts of these verbs that are key to understanding what we're doing. And I think then that if you know the difference, recognize the difference between the stem and the root, that is really important. And the present tense is not necessarily the root, it's the stem of the present, of the verbal form, but not necessarily the root of the verb. And if you're aware then of the root of the verb, and there's not that many to learn in my view, there's probably not more than about 25 to actually learn in respect to the principal parts, and then with the structure of paradigms that we know, you work out the rest. I think that that's really better, the best way of doing it, rather than going Mounce's way of giving you such detail. I'll give you an example, the example of liquid verbs that he mentions there in the chapter. Liquid verbs that the last letter of the verbal root is a liquid. Lambda, mem, noon, rho. And so what does the future add? For example, of meno, I remain, it adds an epsilon and a sigma, he says. So in other words, you get men, which is the root, and then to add it to that, what you have is the epsilon, sigma, and then the endings he gives, what does he give? First person plural, amen. So therefore what happens in the future is that the sigma drops out, he says. All right, the sigma drops out, and that leaves you then with an ending from the stem, the ending from the root, which is an epsilon, and then the ending of the perfect active first person plural is an omicron, so that I always learned it like this, plus r equals u. So in other words, then it's going to be menumen, and menumen, and that's going to tell you then that it's future. Okay, fair enough. But then you notice he mentions in a footnote there that the sigma drops out. Okay, and then he says he calls it an intervocalic sigma. That was it. And then he also says, this is in the footnotes, that not all verbs like this do that. In other words, how far do you want to go in actually determining the origin of how a verb ends up like it does? And of course you do the same thing with nouns. Well, I suppose you've got to do it so far as it satisfies you. At this point, in my view, learn the principal parts, be aware of some of the general notions in terms of labials and so on, dentals, of how they actually form, what the difference is between especially between the root and the stem of a verb. And then if you learn those principal parts, you'll recognize them. You'll recognize them when they come up, and if you don't, then you'll get a feeling when you come across a verb that this is, quote, irregular, which will cause you to track it down to look for its verbal root in respect to that. But frequently you'll be able to work it out on the basis of the what I'd call the suffix or the ending that's put on it, in terms of the tense also, whether it's got a kappa in it, which will tell you it's perfect, and so forth from that standpoint. So if I can just pull back a bit there and just say, just hold it, don't be too scared with this. Just recognize that we're going through principal parts, and the principal parts are going to be the present, the future, aorist, active and passive, and perfect active and passive, in which we can work out all the other forms. So at this point, keep that in mind. And those of you who are interested in it, who want to actually delve into it in such a way that you see the origin of the etymology perhaps of these verbs, that's fine too, where you can understand it. But you'll come to a point where you've got a blank. In other words, when you're looking at an intervocalic sigma, and you find out that that's not necessarily the case in the verb, and then you've got to ask why. How did it develop like that? Well, I think sometimes these verbs just develop through use, and then the absorption of consonants and vowels contracting and so on, consonants being lost out in terms of the way that they were articulated. That's how I presume it is, just like it is in English. Maybe in a century, Americans will not have the letter T on the end of certain words, because I notice, being English, that some words that Californians use, they drop the T on. For example, I'm interested. Even then, I couldn't resist my English pronunciation, which is putting T in there. I'm interested. I'm interested. There we go. Or it's perfect. You can't. It's almost like the articulation of the T there is not there, and maybe that will drop out in a century. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe they'll all drop out, and we'll all be doing text language and so forth with textese. I don't know. But at this point, then I just say to you. Principal parts of the key, especially knowing the difference between the root and the stem, recognizing that the present is not the root, but the present is the stem, and the root is behind that. So don't be confused in thinking that the fundamental element, because we've learned it first of all, is the present indicative active sense of a verb. And then in the next couple of weeks we'll learn the other forms of verbs, and it won't be that long before we get through this, so just hold on at this point, and please contact me if you have any problems, where we can talk over the phone, or we can talk as I email you, or you email me, and so forth. All right, let's keep going. All right, thanks.